Chapter 54 The Terrible Comet. The star which rules thy destiny was ruled ere earth began by me. It was a world as fresh and fair as ever revolved around sun in air. Its course was free and regular, space blossomed not a lovelier star. The hour arrived, and it became a wandering mass of shapeless flame, a pathless comet and a curse, the menace of the universe. Still rolling on with innate force, with a sphere, without a course, a bright deformity on high, the monster of the upper sky. Manfred, Seventh Spirit, Byron. Next morning at the break of day, Asterion and his companions departed for the South Pole. There was something almost superhuman in the inexhaustible energy, vitality, and endurance of this extraordinary young man. He seemed insensible to mental or bodily fatigue. His physical resources were immense, and he seemed to concentrate within himself the power of 20 men. During his interplanetary journeys, he would often pass days and nights without sleep, enduring a severe and unremitting brain and nerve strain that would drive the strongest terrestrial man insane. Yet a few hours' sleep would fully restore him. He seemed to derive the recuperation of his vital powers more from the cosmic forces amidst which he roamed than aught else. His diet was simplicity itself. He never touched dainties or luxuries of any kind, nor the usual products of the cuisine. A few morsels of bread, fruits, and a glass or two of milk was all. He would not take in 3 days what would barely suffice for the noon lunch of a terrestrial gourmand, and often would go several days without touching a morsel. He never had an idle moment, continually on his journeys or immersed in his scientific studies. Although only 26 years of age, his scientific attainments were immense. He was familiar with as many branches as professors who had spent their lives in mastering one single speciality. His knowledge of astronomy, with all its intricate and abstract and abstruse calculations, involving the highest departments of mathematics, was profound, and whenever the Astronomer Royal and his colleagues were unable to solve a knotty problem, they would submit it to him, and he would unravel it in a trice. He cared nothing for society, nor the usual recreations and pleasures that absorb the gay world. His character was simple and ingenuous. He loved to commune with nature, the woods, birds, and animals. His favorite pets were a donkey, an owl, a pig, a monkey, and a peacock. The first 3, he was wont to say, were the best teachers of patience, wisdom, and true philosophy. The last two taught vanity and frivolity of human affairs among man and womankind generally. He had an admirable fund of wit, and sometimes indulged in a little dry humor. Several of his ancestors had lost their lives in the pursuit of their professions as interplanetary navigators, and he fully expected to meet the same fate, but was as indifferent about it as any sailor. Some elegant society exquisites, who led lives of ease and pleasure and took excellent care of their precious selves, of which a goodly number float around our terrestrial fashionable circles, once asked him, "Where did your father die, Asterion?" "Lost his life on one of these journeys." "And your grandfather?" "Same way, and great-grandfather ditto." "We should think you would be afraid to go. It is very dangerous for you." "Where did your fathers die, gentlemen?" "In their beds." "And your grandfathers?" "In their beds." "Also. And your great-grandfathers?" "In their beds, of course. All our ancestors died in their beds." "I should think you would be very afraid to go to bed. It's very dangerous for you." He had been gone for 2 weeks. One morning the following dispatch was received by the Duke. "Ethervolt Station, South Pole. I have this moment returned, have traversed part of the meteoric belt crossing our orbit, several million miles in various directions. It is 2 million miles wide and 100,000 miles thick. Entire circuit probably over 3,000 million miles. Number of isolated streams floating in outlying space, dimensions from several thousand to 1,000,000 or more square miles in extent and moving irregularly in neighborhood of orbit, densely packed with enormous bodies and urnularies like those of the late shower. Have calculated elements of a few. One is directly approaching. 60,000 miles long, speed 50 miles a minute. It will pass equator 2,000 miles above surface. 10 o'clock tomorrow night will strike both moons. Bulk of showers will fall in Vodranga Ocean. New comet approaching from the west quarter of heavens. Has probably passed through the asteroidal zone. Comet sword-shaped, 60 million miles long. 100,000 miles diameter. Speed 5 million miles per day. Course directly towards the meteoric belt. Will strike in 7 days. I predict extraordinary disturbances in the belt. Widespread scattering of meteoric streams and offshoots. Shall return immediately to resume observations on comet. Have communicated with the astronomer Solaris. Watch moons tomorrow night at hour specified. Asterion. By 9 o'clock next evening, our party repaired to the observatory. Several professors of the Royal University and members of the Academy of Sciences were assembled. Astronomer Solaris and his colleagues were at their posts in the great rotunda. The giant equatorial was slowly revolving on its ponderous pedestal through the channel in the dome, and its enormous object glass leveled on the angry moon, which were nearly in opposition with each other, and coursing low down over the southern horizon in the cloudless sky. Never was an eclipse of sun or moon, occultation of planet or star, transit of Venus, or any other celestial phenomenon watched on Earth with such intense and absorbing interest, not to speak of anxiety, as was this approaching meteoric downfall, upon the results of which might remotely hang the fate of a world. Short tubes with eyepieces had been adjusted to the instrument, which enabled several persons to view the phenomenon simultaneously. We counted the moments as they passed. 10 o'clock struck. "Contact is beginning," said Astronomer Solaris. Immediately in front of Rohanza appeared a long, slender, conical-shaped nebulous cloud, shining with a misty light, its apex pointing forward. It looked like some gigantic aerial shark suddenly sprung from the dark abyss to devour her. In a few moments the apex touched the orb, which seemed to be gradually drawn within the maw of the nebulous monster. The other moon, Arunia, also disappeared. What convulsions these two moons endured, engulfed within the bowels of this meteoric tempest, eye hath never seen. Time passed on, and they emerged from the base of the cloud. Their appearance was frightful. Rohanza, which had borne the full brunt of the bombardment, was spouting torrents of crimson lava, as if her life-blood were oozing from every pore, while Aruna seemed whirling in tornadoes of fire and smoke. The cosmic monster now curved swiftly downwards and plunged to the depths of the Vodranga Ocean. Every man in that great rotunda grew pale. Not a word was spoken, not a sound was heard, save the measured ticking of the astronomical clock, whose wheel silently revolved the huge telescope on its axis step by step, keeping its long tube parallel with and its enormous eyes fixed on the celestial body as it rolls along the heavens. The assistants, seated at their desks by their glimmering lights under the dark shadows of the lofty dome, silently worked at their calculations. The Astronomer Royal now approached the Grand Duke and Prince. "As the full effects of this collision on our moon may not be manifested for many hours," said he, "I will communicate to your Highness the results of our observations, soon as completed." The assembly took their departure, and it was doubtful whether among them a single eye was closed in sleep that night, certainly not at the palace. Notwithstanding the anxiety caused by the terrible phenomenon, the cool head of the astronomer and his colleagues immediately went to work, and after many hours' laborious calculations, confirmed the accuracy of Asterion's conclusion to the letter. How this extraordinary young man, shut up within the narrow confines of his ethervolt car, whirled day and night amid these awful meteoric tempests, continually on the watch to avoid fatal collisions, and with necessarily limited facilities for making such abstruse and careful investigations at hand, could correctly accomplish them, awakened the astonishment and admiration of the Astronomical Society. Had some terrestrial tourist caught on the crater of Mount Vesuvius amid one of its most terrible eruptions, and running the gauntlet of its lava streams and hottest scorial downpour, had been able to solve a problem in integral calculus or conical sections, in the midst of it, the feat would not be half so great. The next day the following dispatch from the observatory was received by the Duke. Aruna has descended 10 miles and Rohenza 6 miles below their former positions. Combustible action progressing with increased violence on both satellites. No perceptible variation in their orbital velocities apparent. Solaris. As the publication of this news would only serve to increase the general apprehension and alarm, it was decided by the Astronomical Society to withhold them from the public for the present. The days passed on. All were anxiously awaiting news from Asterion in relation to the most important event, the approach of the new comet. The intrepid voyager was many million miles distant, watching its advent, calculating its elements and the widespread perturbations it would produce in its rush through the meteoric belt, which our planet was steadily approaching. Such a phenomenon is certainly the most tremendous that could possibly take place in this vast abysses of space, the destruction of a world, perhaps excepted. The fiery dragon of chaos, seemingly endowed with infernal power and speed, its starry nucleus like a malignant cyclopean eye encased in the center of its coma, 100,000 miles in diameter and throwing off its outer envelopes in successive layers which form its train. This train, 60 to 100 or more million miles long, expanding at its extremity into the semblance of a giant broom, bearing in its bosom the most inflammable of all gases, saturated through its whole mass with the most combustible materials, flying in its perihelion passage around the sun at a rate of 200,000 miles per minute, its tail lengthening out at the rate of 20 to 30 million miles per day. This Empyrean monster rushing headlong into a meteoric belt 2 million miles wide and 100,000 miles thick, packed with countless millions of meteorites, bolides and urolites, red and white hot, clashing against each other and flying at a rate of 50 to 100 million miles per second. 100 miles per second, the mind is utterly overwhelmed by any attempt to conceive the tremendous horrors of the scene. The comet had now come in full view, visible by all over the planet every night from sunset to sunrise. Its dimensions were enormous, covering an arc of 30 degrees over the visible heavens. Its shape somewhat resembled a drawn saber, its nucleus brilliant, and the stars shining through its thin, gauzy film. In these clear Martian skies, its appearance was much more bright and beautiful than comets seen from Earth. It was rapidly approaching the track of the meteorite belt, hourly watched by every observatory on Mars and millions of people. The results expected from its transit were looked forward to with great anxiety. 7 days passed. The time for the collision was at hand. For several days, extraordinary disturbances had been noticed in the aerial electric currents. Great magnetic storms had been seen on the sun and changes also observed in the belts of Jupiter. These, however, were not deemed sufficient to produce the disturbances. The vicinity of the comet was unquestionably the exciting cause. Telegraphic communication through the aerial currents had been greatly disturbed and during the last 12 hours were entirely cut off in the northwest hemisphere. On the evening of the 7th day, a violent storm took place, accompanied with unusual thunder and lightning, which were almost incessant. We were assembled in the reception room. The storm increased in fury and violence. The rain fell in torrents. The sky was black as midnight. The thunder peals shook the palace to its foundations. Suddenly a loud crash was heard outside. We sprang to our feet. There was a clamor of voices. The door burst open, and Asterion rushed into the room, his face pale as a corpse, his hair disheveled, his eyes bloodshot, his garments torn, blood flowing from a deep wound in his forehead. He staggered forward and feebly gasped out, "Comet dashed through the belt last night, tore apart to fragments, drew off clouds, many offshoots following in train, meteoric stream 90,000 miles long coming ahead, 10,000 miles a minute, will strike Machiavel and Perthanthos by midnight, quick, warn Polath, Harrovian, if too late, millions will perish," and he sank down insensible. For a moment all stood speechless with horror. "Telegraphic communication is cut off," shouted the Duke. "Haste! Sound the alarm! Out with the airships! Fly to the kingdoms of Polath and Harrovian instantly!" The whole palace was in confusion. The alarm was sounded over the city. In less than an hour, 1,000 airships were flying swifter than the hurricane to the kingdoms of Polath and Prince Horovian, which were on the opposite side of the hemisphere, 6,000 and 8,000 miles distant respectively. It was 7 o'clock. Could they reach them in time? No. The swiftest ships at fullest power of speed could only make from 250 to 300 miles per hour. The only possible hope was the shower might be delayed. We bore the insensible Asturian to a private room, and Dr. Hamoval dressed his wound. His ship had broken in its impetuous downfall amidst the trees. Burras, Viridian, Captain Voltano, and crew were severely stunned. Burras informed us that they had been traversing the belt several million miles since last night. When the comet struck, the belt tore a great gap straight through it, 60 million miles wide, scattering huge clouds of meteorites all around and drawing an immense stream of them in its train. The sight was the most frightful ever seen. Soon as he had discovered the great offshoot, which was swiftly flying towards the planet, Asturian hastened his return, flying at the rate of 200,000 miles per hour ahead of it. Reaching the pole and finding telegraphic communications cut off, he mounted his airship, shot her up 10 miles in the air to the upper polar magnetic current, and flew at the rate of 50 miles per hour per minute. This terrible speed made the interior of the car so hot they were almost suffocated. Reaching the palace in the teeth of the tempest, they plunged down amidst the trees regardless of safety. No ship could have reached those kingdoms in time, said Viridian, for none are provided with a magnetic motor, and none but Asturian understands the working of it. Wherever that awful downfall strikes across those continents, not a soul will be left to tell the tale. Haste! Exclaimed Altafora. Order up another airship and crew. Asturian communicated the secret of his motor to me. Magnetic stations are erected near the palace of King Polath and Prince Horovian. We'll fly there immediately. The ship was brought up in the grounds. Altafora carefully removed the motor from the broken ship and affixed it to the magnetic rod of the new one, and jumped aboard with the crew. The ship rose 5 miles above the surface into the region of calm and sped towards the east at the rate of 50 miles a minute. The hours dragged on. The night was dark and the storm still raging, fit prelude to the awful tempests that would soon break on the other hemisphere of the Martian world. The clock struck midnight. It's the hour, said Duke Athalion in a whisper. We raised the window, and the sky had cleared. The wind moaned through the trees like a sad wailing requiem. Low down in the eastern horizon appeared a long, conical-shaped nebulous mass. It resembled the zodiacal light seen on our Earth before sunrise and sunset at certain seasons of the year, with its base towards the sun and its apex towards the zenith, and the exact nature of which is unknown. The apex of this conoidal mass stretched far out into space. It shone with a faint phosphorescent light. Now and then flashes of cosmic lightning passed through its masses. The blow had struck. The awful tempest was falling on those doomed kingdoms. What untold agony, horror, and despair millions of our friends were now suffering. The moments passed. The cloud sank from view in the eastern horizon, and it passed over the continents beneath us. Soon it emerged on the west horizon and gradually disappeared in the far distant space. All was over, and its fatal work was accomplished.